August 17th, 1945, Manila Harbor, Philippines. Fumiko Tanaka pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the cargo hold, listening to boots echo on the deck above. 23 years old, former nurse with the Imperial Japanese Army's Medical Corps, she had spent the last 72 hours convinced she would be executed at dawn. Around her, in the darkness, 37 other Japanese women huddled in silence, each lost in their own terror. They had been told stories, whispered among the ranks during the final chaotic months of the war about what happened to prisoners. The Americans would torture them, rape them, kill them slowly as revenge for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for 3.5 years of brutal Pacific warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When the heavy door finally scraped open and sunlight flooded the hold, Fumiko squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the rifle shots. Instead, a voice called out in broken Japanese, telling them to come up on deck for a meal. The women looked at each other with confusion and disbelief. A meal before execution, perhaps? A final mockery. As Fumiko climbed the narrow ladder and emerged onto the deck of the transport vessel, she saw tables set up with white plates. Actual china, not the battered tin they had eaten from for months. Steam rose from platters of food. And there, unmistakable even from a distance, was the smell of roasted pork and freshly baked bread. Her knees nearly buckled. She had not seen bread like that since before the war. The pork, precious meat that had disappeared from even officer rations 2 years ago, sat in thick slices beside vegetables she could not name. An American soldier, barely older than 20, gestured for them to sit. His face showed no hatred, no rage, just fatigue and something that looked almost like sympathy. This moment, this impossible collision of expectation and reality, would become the opening chapter of a story that military historians would suppress for decades. The story of Japanese women captured in the final weeks of the Pacific War, their treatment by American forces, and their desperate fight not to return to a Japan that no longer wanted them. It is a story about transformation born from trauma, about enemies who discovered unexpected mercy, and about women who chose exile over homecoming. The official record lists 842 Japanese women taken into American custody between August 1945 and January 1946. But these numbers, like all wartime statistics, conceal as much as they reveal. Behind each digit lies a woman whose life was fractured by conflict and who faced an impossible calculation in the war's aftermath. The context demands understanding. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army had deployed approximately 12,000 women in various support roles throughout the Pacific Theater. They served as nurses, radio operators, code clerks, logistics coordinators, and clerical staff. Unlike their male counterparts, these women occupied a peculiar position in both Japanese military culture and in the eyes of their potential captors. Japanese military doctrine had explicitly forbidden women from carrying weapons or engaging in direct combat, yet their proximity to military operations made them complicit in the eyes of advancing Allied forces. More critically, their very existence contradicted the American public's understanding of Japanese society, which portrayed Japanese women as passive, homebound figures subordinate to male authority. The reality was far more complex. Women like Fumiko Tanaka had volunteered for military service in 1942, driven by a mixture of patriotic fervor and economic necessity. The daughter of a Kyoto textile merchant whose business had collapsed during the Depression years of the 1930s, Fumiko had completed nursing training at Kyoto Imperial University's Medical College, one of only 2 institutions in Japan that admitted women to professional medical programs. When military recruiters arrived at the hospital where she worked in 1941, promising adventure, prestige, and salary double what civilian nurses earned, she had signed the papers immediately. Her parents had protested. Unmarried women did not leave home, did not travel unaccompanied, did not place themselves in proximity to thousands of men without family supervision. But the war had already shattered traditional expectations. By 1942, factories across Japan employed women in roles previously reserved for men. The military's recruitment of women for support positions seemed merely an extension of this necessary transformation. Fumiko's first posting had been to a military hospital in occupied Manila, treating wounded soldiers evacuated from campaigns across the Pacific. The work was brutal and unrelenting. She had witnessed injuries that her university training had never prepared her for. Men burned beyond recognition, limbs shattered by artillery, bodies racked with tropical diseases that turned robust young soldiers into skeletal shadows within weeks. She had learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, to ignore her own hunger while caring for patients, to maintain professional composure while holding the hand of a 19-year-old boy from Hokkaido as he died calling for his mother. The camaraderie among the nursing staff had sustained her. 23 women working together, supporting each other through exhaustion and grief, forming bonds that transcended the military hierarchy. As American forces advanced through the Philippines in early 1945, the hospital staff received orders to evacuate to Manila proper. The city, once the gleaming jewel of American colonial achievement, had become a fortress. Japanese commanders prepared for a final stand, transforming schools, churches, and government buildings into defensive positions. The nursing staff found themselves reassigned to a makeshift medical facility in the basement of a commandeered hotel, treating casualties from the increasingly desperate street fighting that consumed Manila block by block. Fumiko had been working a 30-hour shift when the building shook from an artillery strike 3 blocks away. The lights failed. In the darkness, she heard screaming, felt hands grabbing at her uniform, smelled the acrid smoke of fires spreading through the district. When American troops finally secured the building 4 days later, they found the surviving medical staff huddled in the basement, surrounded by bodies, both dead patients and dead soldiers who had tried to mount a final defense. The Americans had separated the military personnel from the civilian casualties. Male soldiers were marched away immediately, hands bound behind their backs. The women, 18 nurses who had survived the bombardment, stood uncertain in the rubble-strewn street while American officers argued in English too rapid for Fumiko to follow. She understood enough to catch the words problem, protocol, and headquarters repeated multiple times. One officer, a captain whose name badge read Morrison, finally approached them and attempted to communicate in painfully constructed Japanese phrases. They would be transported to a secure location, they would not be harmed, they would receive food and medical attention. The nurses exchanged glances, reading disbelief in each other's faces. During the final months of the war, Japanese military leadership had distributed pamphlets to all personnel describing in graphic detail what capture by American forces would entail. The men would be tortured for intelligence and then executed. The women would suffer far worse. The transport to the harbor had been conducted in silence. American soldiers, young men who looked barely old enough to shave, had surrounded the truck carrying the nurses but had not touched them, had not even spoken to them. Fumiko had watched Manila pass by through the gap in the canvas cover. The city she had known for 3 years was gone, replaced by a landscape of devastation that seemed almost incomprehensible. Entire blocks reduced to blackened frameworks of buildings, churches with their walls standing but roofs collapsed, bodies still lying in the streets, covered with sheets or blankets, awaiting collection. The Americans had won this battle through overwhelming firepower, and the city had paid the price. At the harbor, the nurses had been herded into the cargo hold of a transport ship. The door had closed, leaving them in near darkness. And there they had waited, expecting the worst. The meal on deck that August morning violated every expectation. The American soldiers served the food themselves, placing full plates before each woman with careful attention to ensuring everyone received equal portions. The pork had been seasoned with herbs Fumiko did not recognize, the bread was still warm from the oven, and alongside the meat and bread sat fresh vegetables, carrots and cabbage, and something green that looked like lettuce but tasted sweet and crisp. There was rice, too, properly steamed white rice, not the mixed grain and sawdust mixture that had been standard rations for the last year. And there was water, clean, fresh water in ceramic cups, as much as they wanted to drink. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Fumiko had taken her first bite, expecting poison, expecting some cruel trick. The food was real. She had eaten slowly at first, then with increasing desperation, her body recognizing sustenance after months of progressive malnutrition. Around her, the other nurses did the same, some weeping silently as they ate, overwhelmed by the simple act of being fed. Captain Morrison had appeared again once the meal concluded, this time with a translator, a Nisei soldier whose Japanese carried the distinctive accent of someone raised in Hawaii. The translator introduced himself as Sergeant Kenneth Hayashi and explained that they would be transported to a processing facility on Luzon, where their status would be determined. They were considered prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention protocols. They would be held in secure facilities, but would receive treatment consistent with international law. They would have access to medical care, adequate food, and shelter. They would be protected from harm. The words seemed impossible. Geneva Convention, protected from harm. These concepts belonged to a theoretical world that bore no resemblance to the brutal realities they had experienced, yet the evidence sat in their stomachs, warm bread and pork that spoke more convincingly than any translator's assurances. The processing facility turned out to be a former Philippine Army barracks on the outskirts of San Fernando, 40 miles north of Manila. The Americans had converted it into a holding center for Japanese military personnel awaiting repatriation. When the nurses arrived, they discovered they were not alone. Over the following weeks, more Japanese women would be brought to the facility, nurses from other field hospitals, radio operators captured in communication posts, clerical staff who had been working in administrative offices throughout the occupied territories. By September 1945, the facility held 214 Japanese women, all military personnel, all uncertain of their fate. The Americans had segregated them from male prisoners, housing them in a separate compound with female guards, members of the Women's Army Corps, who had been assigned specifically to manage this unexpected category of captives. The conditions contradicted everything the women had been taught to expect. The barracks were clean, with functioning plumbing and regular trash collection. Medical staff conducted health screenings, treating infections, malnutrition, and injuries sustained during the final chaotic weeks of combat. The food continued to be abundant, 3 meals daily that included meat, vegetables, rice, and bread. There was soap for bathing, clean clothing to replace torn and filthy uniforms, and even small luxuries like toothpaste and combs. The American guards maintained professional distance, but were not cruel. They did not strike prisoners, did not scream at them, did not seem to harbor the murderous rage that Japanese propaganda had promised. This absence of expected brutality created its own form of psychological distress. The women found themselves constantly waiting for the punishment to begin, for the mercy to be revealed as elaborate preliminary to some worse fate. Fumiko had been selected as one of 3 representatives to communicate with the American administrators. Her English, learned during nursing school from textbooks and never practiced with native speakers, was better than most. In daily meetings with Captain Morrison and Sergeant Hayashi, she began to understand the complexity of their situation. The Americans were uncertain how to categorize them. Were they military personnel subject to repatriation under surrender terms? Were they civilian auxiliaries who might be classified differently? The Geneva Convention provided clear protocols for male prisoners of war, but said almost nothing about women in military roles. The legal ambiguity meant delays, bureaucratic confusion, and ultimately an extended stay in American custody while lawyers and policymakers debated their status. Captain Morrison, who proved to be surprisingly sympathetic, explained that the delays might actually work in their favor. Repatriation to Japan would not happen immediately. The Japanese homeland was experiencing catastrophic conditions, worse than anything the propaganda had admitted. Cities destroyed by firebombing, food supplies disrupted, infrastructure collapsed, and a population traumatized by defeat and occupation. The information trickled in through multiple channels. Sergeant Hayashi, who had relatives in Japan, shared what he learned from intelligence reports. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed hundreds of thousands. The firebombing campaigns had destroyed over 60% of urban housing in major cities. Agricultural production had collapsed due to labor shortages and disrupted transportation networks. Starvation was not a distant threat, but a present reality. The American occupation forces were struggling to establish basic order, and the Japanese government existed more in theory than in practice. For women like Fumiko, this information posed a devastating question. What were they returning to? Fumiko's family had lived in Kyoto, which had been spared the firebombing due to its cultural significance, but her last letter from home, received in March 1945, had described increasingly desperate circumstances. Her father's textile business had been completely shuttered, all materials requisitioned for military use. Her mother had been conscripted into a munitions factory. Her younger brother had been drafted and sent to Manchuria, and they had received no word from him since January. The prospect of returning to that situation, as a disgraced military nurse from a defeated army, seemed almost worse than remaining in captivity. The other women shared similar fears, articulated in whispered conversations during the evening hours after the guards had completed their rounds. Returning home meant shame, meant being marked as part of the failed military apparatus that had brought destruction to Japan. Women who had served in the military would be viewed with suspicion, their morality questioned, their marriage prospects destroyed. In traditional Japanese society, a woman's value derived from marriage and family. Military service, especially extended service abroad, in close proximity to men, had irreversibly damaged that value. Several women had been engaged before the war, but all had received letters canceling the arrangements once their families learned of their military postings. The social death awaiting them in Japan seemed, in many ways, more terrifying than physical death would have been. At least in American custody, they were fed, sheltered, and allowed to retain some dignity. What awaited them at home offered none of these things. The first organized resistance emerged in November 1945, when repatriation orders finally arrived. The American military had arranged for transport ships to carry Japanese prisoners back to Yokohama, with women scheduled for the second wave of repatriations in December. When the orders were announced, 112 Japanese women received orders to prepare for departure within 48 hours. They were instructed to gather personal belongings, undergo final medical clearances, and assemble for transport to the harbor. What the American administrators did not anticipate was the coordinated response that the women had been planning since the rejection of their asylum petition. When the transport trucks arrived on December 10th to collect the designated prisoners, they found the women's barracks empty. All 112 had vanished during the night. The disappearance triggered immediate lockdown of the entire facility. Guards searched every building, every storage area, every possible hiding place within the compound perimeter. They found nothing. Captain Morrison, furious and baffled, demanded explanations from the remaining prisoners. The women who had not been scheduled for departure claimed complete ignorance. They had been sleeping. They had heard nothing. They knew nothing about any escape plan. The situation bordered on the impossible. The compound was surrounded by fencing and regular guard patrols. There were no tunnels, no breaches in the perimeter, No evidence of outside assistance, yet somehow more than 100 women had disappeared without trace. The mystery resolved itself 3 days later when a chaplain conducting routine inspection of the facility's chapel discovered the missing women packed into the building's basement storage area. They had been hiding in a space designed to hold maintenance supplies and old furniture, surviving on food they had smuggled from meals over the previous week. When confronted, they refused to leave the basement. They linked arms, forming a human chain that blocked the narrow stairway, and announced through Fumiko, who served as their spokesperson, that they would not board the ships voluntarily. If the Americans intended to send them back to Japan, they would have to be carried aboard by force. The standoff lasted 18 hours. Captain Morrison brought in female interpreters to negotiate. He offered compromises, delayed departure dates, guarantees about landing locations in Japan that would theoretically be safer. The women rejected every proposal. They wanted asylum or, failing that, indefinite detention in American custody. Returning to Japan was not acceptable under any circumstances. The resolution came not from negotiation, but from direct orders transmitted from command levels far above Captain Morrison's authority. Military police, including female personnel from the Women's Army Corps, entered the basement in organized units. They systematically separated the human chain, physically carrying resistant women up the stairs and into waiting trucks. The women did not fight violently, but employed passive resistance, going limp and forcing the guards to drag them. Some screamed, others wept. A few maintained dignified silence. Fumiko was among the last removed, still calling out to the others that resistance was their only moral option, that accepting forced repatriation meant complicity in their own destruction. The trucks departed from Manila Harbor under heavy guard, and by December 14, 1945, all 112 women were aboard the transport vessel Mercy Star, bound for Yokohama. The voyage took 9 days. During that time, 3 women attempted suicide. 2 tried to jump overboard and were restrained by guards who had been specifically instructed to watch for such attempts. The 3rd consumed a quantity of cleaning solution she had somehow acquired and required emergency medical intervention to survive. The American medical staff aboard the Mercy Star documented these incidents with clinical precision, but also with mounting unease. The ship's chief medical officer, Commander Patricia Walsh, noted in her official report that the prisoners displayed symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. They were not behaving like defeated soldiers accepting the terms of surrender. They were behaving like condemned criminals facing execution. Commander Walsh recommended psychiatric evaluation and potential reclassification of prisoner status, but her recommendations went unheeded in the bureaucratic machinery processing thousands of repatriations simultaneously. When the Mercy Star arrived at Yokohama on December 23, 1945, the women disembarked into a Japan that exceeded their worst fears. The harbor district lay in ruins, bombed structures standing like skeletal monuments to destruction. The processing facility where repatriated prisoners were being cataloged operated out of damaged buildings with partially collapsed roofs. Japanese officials conducting the intake interviews appeared exhausted, overwhelmed, and deeply suspicious of women returning from military service. The questions focused not on their welfare, but on their conduct during captivity. Had they cooperated with American forces? Had they provided intelligence? Had they engaged in inappropriate relationships with enemy personnel? The implication was clear. These women were not victims returning home, but potential traitors whose loyalty required verification. Fumiko's intake interview lasted 40 minutes. The Japanese official, a middle-aged bureaucrat whose suit hung loosely on his malnourished frame, seemed less interested in her answers than in documenting her complicity. He noted that she had served as spokesperson for the group that resisted repatriation. He recorded that she had learned English and had communicated regularly with American officers. He asked repeatedly whether she had formed personal attachments to any American personnel. The questions felt designed to construct a narrative of collaboration regardless of her actual responses. When the interview concluded, she received temporary housing assignment to a facility in Yokohama designated for repatriated female military personnel. The facility was a converted school building with no heat, minimal sanitation, and food rations consisting of rice mixed with sawdust and whatever vegetables could be scavenged. The women were expected to find civilian employment as quickly as possible, as the government had no resources to support them indefinitely. The reality of post-war Japan shattered any remaining illusions. Fumiko found work at a medical clinic in Yokohama that desperately needed trained nurses. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover food and shared housing costs. The work itself was overwhelming, treating patients suffering from malnutrition, tuberculosis, and injuries that had never received proper medical attention during the war's final chaotic months. The clinic operated without adequate supplies, forcing staff to reuse bandages, sterilize and reuse needles, and improvise treatments using whatever materials could be obtained. Fumiko's supervisor, an elderly doctor who had managed to keep his practice operating throughout the war, treated her with barely concealed contempt. He made clear that he had hired her only because no other trained nurses were available, and that her service with the military made her morally suspect. She should consider herself fortunate to have employment at all, given her circumstances. The social isolation proved more difficult than the material hardship. Fumiko's family, when she finally made contact with them in Kyoto, responded with strained politeness that barely masked their shame. Her father's business had not recovered and likely never would. Her mother had developed respiratory problems from factory work and was now an invalid. Her younger brother remained missing, presumed dead in Manchuria. The family could not support her return to Kyoto, nor did they particularly want the social stigma of having a former military nurse living openly in their household. Her father suggested, with uncomfortable delicacy, that perhaps she might find opportunities in Tokyo or Osaka, larger cities where anonymity was possible and her past might not follow her so obviously. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome in the family home. Her service, intended as patriotic duty, had marked her as an outcast. Other women from the Mercy Star faced similar or worse circumstances. Several discovered that their families had been killed in the firebombing campaigns. Others found families who had survived but who rejected them outright, viewing their military service as shameful and their capture as dishonorable. The traditional expectation that women would marry and be supported by husbands had been destroyed by the war's demographic catastrophe. Millions of military-aged men had died in combat, creating a massive imbalance between men and women of marriageable age. The remaining men had their choice of potential wives and universally avoided women with military backgrounds. The social mathematics were brutal. These women had no family support, no marriage prospects, and limited employment opportunities in an economy that could barely feed its existing population. By March 1946, Fumiko had established contact with 7 other nurses from her original unit through carefully worded letters sent through the makeshift postal system. They shared information about their circumstances, discussed survival strategies, and began formulating an impossible plan. They would find a way to return to American custody. The plan seemed absurd on its surface. How could defeated Japanese nationals living in occupied Japan arrange to be taken back into captivity by the occupying forces? Yet the more they discussed it, the more feasible it appeared. The American occupation forces needed interpreters, clerical staff, and medical personnel to support their operations in Japan. Japanese nationals with English language skills and professional training were in demand. If they could secure employment with the occupation authorities, they could remove themselves from Japanese society and place themselves under American protection. If not formally, then practically. Fumiko applied for interpreter positions with the Occupation Administration in Yokohama. Her English, though imperfect, was functional, and her medical background made her valuable for work in the public health initiatives that occupation forces were implementing to prevent epidemic disease. In April 1946, she received appointment as a medical interpreter assigned to a team conducting tuberculosis screenings in displaced persons camps. The position came with food rations from American supplies, housing in facilities maintained by occupation forces, and most critically, separation from mainstream Japanese society. She was no longer a disgraced former military nurse struggling in a hostile homeland. She was an employee of the occupation, granted protected status and tangible benefits that few Japanese civilians could access. The other women from her network followed similar paths. Some became interpreters. Others found positions as clerical staff in occupation offices. Two secured employment as nurses in hospitals operated by American Military Medical Corps. These positions created a strange parallel to their time in custody. They were once again under American authority, once again dependent on American resources, once again operating in a liminal space between Japanese and American identity. But this time, they had chosen it. This time they were employees rather than prisoners. The distinction mattered psychologically, even if the practical realities were not vastly different. Not all the women who had resisted repatriation found such solutions. Of the 112 who had hidden in the chapel basement, Fumiko maintained contact with perhaps 20 over the following months. The others vanished into the chaos of post-war Japan. Some likely died from disease or malnutrition. Others may have found ways to survive that they preferred not to document. A few returned to family situations, accepting whatever shame and hardship that entailed. The fragmentary nature of their dispersal meant that no comprehensive record exists of their ultimate fates. They became footnotes in a history that preferred not to examine them too closely. Back in the Philippines, the resistance movement had continued to develop among the Japanese women who remained in American custody. By January 1946, the population at the San Fernando facility had grown to 417 women as more prisoners were transferred from other locations. The American authorities had decided to consolidate all female Japanese military personnel in one location to simplify administration and processing. This consolidation, intended to improve efficiency, instead created conditions for organized resistance on a scale the Americans had not anticipated. The women formed committees to coordinate their responses to repatriation orders. They developed communication networks to share information and strategies. They created support systems to sustain those who were struggling with the psychological strain of extended captivity and uncertain futures. The second mass repatriation attempt occurred in February 1946. This time the Americans were prepared for resistance. They conducted the operation with overwhelming force and precision timing. Transport trucks arrived before dawn, and military police moved through the barracks waking prisoners and directing them to assembly areas. Women who refused to comply were physically removed from their bunks and carried to the trucks. The entire operation took less than 2 hours, and by mid-morning, 203 women were en route to Manila Harbor.
The resistance this time took different form. Rather than hiding or passive resistance, the women engaged in calculated non-compliance. They moved slowly, requiring guards to physically assist them at every step. They claimed illness, necessitating medical evaluations that consumed hours. They lost identification documents, forcing delays while paperwork was reconstructed. They asked endless questions through interpreters, demanding clarification of procedures and protocols. Each individual act of resistance was minor, but the cumulative effect slowed the process dramatically. Captain Morrison, exhausted and frustrated, recognized what they were doing. They were making repatriation so difficult and time-consuming that the American military might eventually conclude that keeping them was easier than sending them back. It was a strategy born of desperation, but executed with intelligence and coordination. Morrison filed reports requesting guidance from higher command about how to handle systematic nonviolent resistance from prisoners who technically had no legal right to refuse repatriation, but whose cooperation was practically necessary for efficient processing. The responses he received were bureaucratic and unhelpful, essentially instructing him to complete repatriations as quickly as possible while adhering to Geneva Convention standards. How to accomplish both goals simultaneously when the prisoners were actively undermining the process remained his problem to solve. The breakthrough came not from American initiative, but from an unexpected legal development. In March 1946, a young attorney with the occupation government's legal section, Lieutenant Sarah Chin, daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd become a lawyer before joining the Women's Army Corps, began reviewing the cases of Japanese women resisting repatriation. Chin noticed that the Geneva Convention's provisions regarding prisoners of war assumed certain conditions that did not apply to these women. Specifically, the convention assumed prisoners had a functioning government to return to and a homeland that would accept them. For many of these women, neither condition was met. Their families had rejected them, Japanese society viewed them as shameful, the government could not guarantee their welfare or safety. In legal terms, repatriating them might constitute delivering them to persecution rather than returning them to their country of origin. Lieutenant Shen drafted a memorandum arguing that the women resisting repatriation should be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons. As displaced persons, they would fall under different legal frameworks and would have potential pathways to remain in occupied territories or even immigrate to other countries. The memorandum went through multiple levels of review, generating heated debate among military lawyers and State Department officials. Some argued that creating a displaced persons category for enemy nationals set dangerous precedent. Others maintained that the unique circumstances justified exceptional treatment. The debate consumed months, while the women in San Fernando remained in limbo, neither definitively being repatriated nor being released to some alternative status. During this period, the conditions at San Fernando gradually improved. The American military, recognizing that the prisoners might remain in custody indefinitely, upgraded facilities and expanded programs. They brought in English language instructors to offer classes. They arranged for work details that paid small wages. They permitted more freedom of movement within the compound and organized recreational activities. The facility began to resemble less a prison camp and more a restrictive refugee settlement. For women who had spent months expecting forced return to Japan, these developments offered fragile hope that alternatives might emerge. Fumiko, working in Yokohama, heard about these changes through letters from women still in custody and felt profound bitterness that she had been forced back to Japan just months before circumstances shifted in ways that might have allowed her to remain under American protection.